Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Sandra Yamate. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is under siege, and that this siege has gained traction is rooted in the lack of information and understanding that too many Americans have about who Americans are, including our disparate backgrounds, histories, experiences, and perspectives. Moreover, we find ourselves subjected to efforts intended to drive wedges between us and undermine our abilities to find common ground, build consensus, and work collaboratively toward a better country and a better world. Today's program and our entire History and Heritage Month series is intended to help us better understand each other. Contrary to what some would have us believe, diversity, equity, and inclusion are not dirty words, and DEI is not illegal. That some seek to perpetrate this false narrative is one reason why IILP presents this series of webinars for each of the various History, Heritage, or Awareness Months. It is more important than ever to explore facets of our knowledge about the diversity we seek to embrace and advance when we talk about DEI. We found that many in the legal profession agree, and they're ready to dig into DEI. They want to learn about the diversity of communities that all contribute to the multicultural fabric that is the United States, so as to better support their own communities, to become better allies and friends to others, and to continue to seek the strength and diversity that has shaped the United States for the better. Today's program celebrates Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, Heritage Month. By doing just that, the MENA community has found itself in the forefront of issues around free speech and advocacy. And today we're going to examine how that is playing out and what we're learning from it by giving MENA lawyers who are leaders in that community an opportunity to discuss it publicly. During today's program, please feel free to post questions to the Q&A. We'll try to address as many as possible, time permitting. And please note that our panelists are speaking in their individual capacities only. Our moderator today is Yusuf Shikani. Yusuf is an associate with Shikardi and Bacon. ILP has been proud to include him as a member of the second cohort of our Social Impact Incubator. A litigator, Yusuf's practice focuses on complex litigation in tort and product liability defense. He earned his BS in accounting from Oakland University and his JD from Michigan State, where he served on the law review and as class president. So Yusuf, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that kind of introduction, and more importantly, for your leadership. The work you and the Institute for Inclusion in the legal profession are doing is nothing short of critical. Your firm isn't working if your firm isn't working with IILP yet, I'd strongly encourage you to change that. Through initiatives like the Social Impact Incubator, I've seen firsthand just how powerful this work can be, not only creating more inclusive spaces, but in helping shape the future of our profession in ways that are bold, nuanced, and long overdue. Now I know it's Arab American Heritage Month, which means everything suddenly becomes, well, Arabic. Arabic food, Arabic people, Arabic vibes, like we're all just roaming adjectives. My wife said that joke wouldn't hit. It probably didn't, but in my head, I'm pretending like you guys are laughing on that one. Quick note, Arabic is a language. Unless you're out here garnishing grape leaves with grammar, you meant Arab food. Syntax matters, especially when your culture is constantly getting autocorrected. But beyond the English mislabels, and they call us foreigners, this month is really about voice. Who gets to use it? Who's told to quiet down, and what it means for MENA lawyers to speak freely in a profession that, yes, may be full of talkers, but still isn't always built for our truths, for our names, and for our narratives. Hell, my middle name is Medhet, which autocorrects as midget every time. And you gotta love Arab traditions, like using your dad's first name as your middle name. Just ask my little sister. Let's just say the M in her middle name doesn't stand for Marie, no matter what she tells people. So with that, I'm honored to be moderating today's conversation and to introduce a truly remarkable panel of legal professionals. Let's start with their bios. Samaya Noosh is a partner in the law firm of McDermott, Will, and Emery LLP, and is based in the firm's Chicago office. Samaya has a corporate, transactional, and regulatory practice focused on the representation of hospitals and health systems through strategic corporate transactions. Outside of the substantive practice of law, Samaya is dedicated to improving the diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging of underrepresented talent in the legal profession. Samaya serves on the board of directors of the Muslim Bar Association here in Chicago and has served on the board of directors of the Illinois Association of Healthcare Attorneys and the associate board to the Chicago Committee on Minorities in Large Law Firms, respectively. Samaya is also an adjunct professor at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, where she teaches corporate transactions and health law. Please help me welcome Samaya. Ahmed Rahab is our next panelist. He is the executive director of the Chicago Office of Council on American Islamic Relations, known as CARE, and as well as CARE's National Strategic Communications Director. CARE is the nation's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy group. With 2 decades in leadership and institution building, Rahab is regarded as a national leading expert on U.S. civil rights, media relations, and Islam West relations. He has given hundreds of public lectures and presentations at university campuses and public stages coast to coast and around the world. Rahab has been interviewed thousands of times on various local, national, and global TV and cable news programs, as well as national and international print media. His op-eds have been published in numerous newspapers around the country. Rahab served as a board member of the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ICIRR, as vice president of Refugee One, a co-founder of the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University, a board member and secretary of the Egyptian American Society, a member of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, CCGA, Muslim Task Force, and an Eisenhower Fellow of the American Assembly. Rahab is the founding president of Amrex Consulting and Amrex Media, a trustee of Al Azhar Islamic Foundation, and an adjunct professor at the American Islamic College. And we're incredibly grateful to have him here today. Please help me welcome Rahab. All right. Our next panelist is Jinan Shihad, and she is a civil rights attorney at the Muslim Legal Fund of America, MLFA, where she litigates and advocates on issues related to free speech, government transparency, and national security. She earned her JD from Georgetown University Law Center in 2023, where she focused on civil rights litigation and impact advocacy. During law school, Jinan served in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Section, where she investigated and litigated systemic constitutional violations by law enforcement and other governmental entities. She also represented refugees seeking asylum through Georgetown's Center for Applied Legal Studies, successfully litigating and achieving asylum for her clients. Additionally, Jinan worked at the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, on landmark cases involving government accountability, free expression, and criminal justice reform. Jinan studied public policy and Islamic world history at DePaul University right here in Chicago, where she served as president of Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, and vice president of the Muslim Students Association, MSA. She's the co-founder and former chair of SJP Chicago and the co-founder and co-president of Law Students for Justice in Palestine at Georgetown Law. She is also the founder of Hearts for Humanity, a national youth-led campaign that has raised over $1 million for humanitarian causes across the globe. Please help me welcome Jinan. All right. Our next panelist is none other than Yada Rashad, who is a senior associate at Shook Hardy & Bacon. Her practice focuses on complex business disputes, including privacy and cybersecurity litigation, insurance coverage, and employment matters as a litigator. Yara's legal acumen extends to every stage of litigation, from early discovery to trial and appellate advocacy. She has extensive experience managing complex discovery, taking and defending depositions, briefing dispositive motions, and presenting arguments before judges and juries in open court. In addition to her courtroom work, Yara is a trusted legal advisor who regularly counsels her clients on compliance with state and federal privacy laws, workplace regulations, and evolving regulatory requirements. She has been a featured speaker at several professional engagements addressing topics such as cybersecurity and privacy, federal securities regulation, and ethical considerations related to the use of artificial intelligence in the legal profession. Outside of her commercial practice, Yara serves as an adjunct professor of criminal law at Benedictine University. Yara also maintains an active pro bono docket and has served as lead trial counsel for several indigent indigent defendants in both civil and criminal cases. At her firm, Yara is a mentor to junior associates and an active member of the Middle Eastern Employee Resource Group, where she works on fostering safe spaces for inclusion, advocacy, and allyship. Please help me welcome Yara. All right. Last but not least, we have Tariq Akil, who is a corporate and M&A associate at Baker McKenzie here in Chicago, where he advises clients on complex domestic and cross-border transactions, including private equity deals, venture capital investments, and strategic mergers and acquisitions. His practice spans early-stage investing, joint ventures, and fund-related transactions involving major private equity firms and sovereign wealth funds. Todd's recent work includes high-value deals across industries, from advising Spirix and Sarco Engineering on a $325 million acquisition to supporting emerging companies through capital raises and fundraising. Tariq holds a JD and MBA in finance from the Michigan State University, both summa cum laude, and a BA in psychology from Brown University. A proud Egyptian American, he brings a global perspective to transactional work and is deeply committed to advancing representation, ethical leadership, and economic equity within the legal and business communities. Please help me welcome Tariq Akil. All right. Well, we will get things started here. I really want to just say thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for taking the time to have this important discussion. And we'll start things off just with a, before we hop into free speech, I think it's important to address something that, a lot of people ask about, and that is, Middle Eastern communities and the acronym MENA, Middle Eastern and North African. It has gained traction in recent years, but it's still a, contested and evolving identity category in both law and public discourse. So I'll open this to all panelists, whoever really wants to hop in here, but how do you personally relate to the term MENA? And does it feel accurate, incomplete, political, or empowering? How would you describe it?
I'm
Now, I
happy to
know
get us
everyone's jumping
started.
in on this.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to get us started. And I'm also thank you. Oh, you started us off really well. Thank you, Yusuf, by kind of acknowledging, right, that um, we are not a homogenous group, right? And so we'll talk about why this acronym might be imperfect. But on the one hand, I think it's really helpful to have an acronym like MENA to help create community and help us identify with a racial category or an ethnic category that we just wasn't available 20 years ago or not even that long ago. But so I think it's helpful for us to find a category that better fits. But just a couple criticisms of that acronym. One, it definitely is a colonial term, right? Middle East of what? North. So it's still it's still not perfect, and it totally kind of obscures that within this really large group of people, right, the way that we individually identify is very different. And the group of people covered by this include other racial categories, right? Like it doesn't really acknowledge the Blackness within our community. So there's a lot of criticisms of it, but I do think, on the whole, it allows us to kind of figure out here, and by here I mean, in this diaspora away from the Middle East and North Africa, how to come together in community and fellowship.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maya. And I couldn't agree more. One, I always loved, the mix here and also just the different perspectives, in terms of, the acronym. And I agree, it's something it's kind of one of those things. It's the best we have at hand, and so it's really nice to have that term and to be able to, have the, this form as a result. Anybody else want to, touch on this one? Or yeah, go ahead, Yara.
I mean, I agree with what Sumaya said. I think that in the workplace in particular, I appreciate the term MENA more probably than in other contexts. Not because it's perfect, but because it creates visibility in a space where we are often invisible. I think that having a MENA affinity group can provide connection and community for people who share linguistic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. But that said, I do think it's important to be intentional about how the group defines itself. because the acronym doesn't capture everyone who might feel connected to the space, as Samaya mentioned. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the spirit of any sort of MENA affinity group should be more expansive than the label itself.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate both, perspectives and kind of, the outline of just the MENA background. And, so now I kind of want to transition to the free speech aspect. So before we even get into all these questions, I really thought it was important to kind of just understand and break down a little bit for folks, both in the community and outside, just really the MENA term, and as well as, free speech in today's climate. And so the next question, I also want to open it up to all the panelists again here is, we're here to talk about free speech and advocacy, terms that carry real legal, professional, and cultural weight. From your lens, as legal practitioners in your respective fields or advocates, how do you define free speech in the context of the workplace or legal profession today? And one person I do want to maybe send this off to is maybe Tawnik, because we had talked a little bit about what does free speech look like in a business setting, and so I think maybe you could chime in a little bit on this one.
Sure. Thank you, Yusuf. You're doing an excellent job, by the way, and appreciate being here. At the outset, I would like to, for me personally, free speech is the ability to show up who you are, and with your identity, with your beliefs, with your backgrounds at your workplace, right? But I do want to say there's a distinction between the First Amendment free speech right, which protects citizenry against censorship by the government, and free speech in a private enterprise like a business, right? So those are two distinct areas. So I think there may be a misconception at times that the right of free speech means you can say whatever you want whenever you want, but that's not the case. So in a private enterprise like a law firm or your place of work, there is an ability for your employer to constrain what you say to some sort of respect, right? If it's not aligned with the business interests, if it's harming the business reputation, or if it's just not in congruence with their social media policy even, right? So for me, free speech when it comes to the workplace is just for me to be able to show up as an Egyptian American, express my identity, express my faith, and be accepted in a lot of ways, right? But not necessarily to go out there and express my opinions across the board. So
you don't walk into Baker McKenzie with a picket sign, when you come
I
in.
don't do that. I definitely do not do that. But
only joking. And
Yeah.
I completely, I think that's a really important, aspect to raise. I think that a lot of times, we understand that we have, our, amendment rights, First Amendment, but what does that look like in the context of employer-employee relationships? And, one thing that I kind of maybe want to just, pivot, I want others to kind of, jump in on the conversation here is, what about when your employer, if you feel your employer is maybe applying, that sort of, policy to one group, but not the other? What does it look like when maybe one group is able to kind of have that sort of, additional free speech layer to it, but another group doesn't? Anybody, want to chime in, on this as well?
I mean, I'm happy to just talk from an employment lawyer perspective because, while, I certainly agree that the First Amendment in of itself is, focused on government speech. However, private employers aren't beyond scrutiny when it comes to restrictions on free speech, because if there is a situation where the employer is disciplining certain speech disproportionately, particularly if that speech involves ethnic or religious or racial identity, they open themselves up to some very real claims of discrimination or retaliation. So I do think it is an area for employers to be cognizant of, even if maybe the traditional way that we view the First Amendment under the Constitution might not be applicable to those settings.
Thank you, Yara. Yeah, I agree. Ahmed, I also saw you unmute there. Did you want to chime in on this as well?
Well, first, let me throw my hat into the ring of category of people who are proud Egyptians. I heard Tariq say that, and I got a little jealous. It wasn't in my bio.
Here we go.
It's
If
Arab
anybody
American
knows Arab,
Heritage Month.
Egyptian.
I
I don't
think we're
normally,
close to outnumbering them.
I know. And I picked it's my fault.
I don't normally fly, national origin flags, but it's Arab American Heritage Month, so heck, why not? But to get to the point that is being discussed right now, I fully agree with Yara, and I agree with you earlier that really you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the idea of a double standard, especially as it relates to freedom of conscience. And really, that is the term that I use the most. I mean, freedom of speech, that is a consequence of freedom of conscience. You can only articulate your conscience. You can't, sort of bat logo it into the sky. We have words, we write, we speak, but really we do that because we have something to convey. And that something in this instance that we're trying to protect with freedom is your conscience. Now, whether that is religion or a philosophical belief that you live by, as an American citizen, as a human being, as a person on this land, you ought to have the right to be able to carry your conscience as part of your identity without having to leave it at the door of your school or employer in a way that doesn't disrupt business or doesn't disrupt the public peace, of course. But that is what is being adjudicated at the moment. That is the forefront of the larger battle that we're seeing that is having all these consequences, and we'll talk about today, I'm sure. But it comes down to that freedom of conscience and whether we're allowed to express it and its mischaracterization very purposefully in order to limit it.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think this kind of transitions well to, and I want to go to Jinan here. In the context of free speech protections, and do you feel like they're equally applied, to Arab and Muslim professionals, and particularly when they speak up about Palestine or U.S. foreign policy? And what patterns or disparities have you personally observed?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Yusuf, again, for moderating this conversation and to the organizers. This is definitely a very needed time to have this conversation. And I think you all started us off really beautifully in talking about free speech and what it means to each of us, about bringing your authentic self, but also discussing, I know a lot of law firms, they have this like the DEI, like bringing in your authentic self, but asking ourselves, how is this just a marketing tactic, or are we actually practicing free speech and bringing in your authentic self to these law firms? And I think going to your question, first and foremost, not to say the obvious, but yes, we are in an unprecedented time where there's a crackdown on Arab and Muslim professionals in all fields, but especially in the legal field, for speaking up about Palestinian rights and an attempt to criminalize, isolate, and intimidate those who speak up for Palestinian rights. Palestine Legal, actually, they just put out a report that said in 2024, incidents of attacks increased from 55% from 2023 and 600% from 2022. And there are over 162 cases of termination alone and over 400 cases of adverse employment issues. And I know when we hear these numbers, sometimes it's easy for us just to look over them. Lawyers are not good with numbers. But just even speaking to my personal story, when we talk about what does free speech mean in employment, what does it mean to bring in your authentic self? I'll get to more of this later, but for many people that might be familiar, I was actually fired from my job at Foley & Lardner, which is one of the biggest law firms in the United States. Thousands of attorneys, hundreds of offices across the US. And I had started actually the day before I was set to start. After I had was an associate there, I was called into a meeting and I was basically interrogated about my support for Palestinian human rights. And not to go too much into the story, because I know there's more to discuss here, but ultimately when I was fired, something I realized is that others in the firm, other partners who openly advocated for Israeli violence, who said Palestinians must be liquidated, right? Literally quoting, they were not called into a meeting and they were not fired or face any consequence for that matter. So I think here there's obviously a grave difference in terms of how Palestinians and those who speak up for Palestinian rights are treated and how others are treated. But what I want to emphasize here is that this incident, in my story specifically, is part of a broader pattern of attacks that we're seeing against those who speak up for Palestinian rights. And punishing people over their free speech, their support for Palestinian human rights, and attempting to purge them, especially from the law field, that's McCarthyism, as we know. So what we're seeing now is that Palestine specifically is the litmus test. It is the unmasking force behind our legal order, that all these illusions of free speech, they fail when it comes to Palestine, that it is progressive except for Palestine. But I think the fact that we're having this conversation here today is really indicative that, like, you know, there are spaces where we can have this conversation and be open with each other of, you know, even when things are uncomfortable, how do we talk about it? And it's so interesting because for one of the things my law firm conflated with my support for Palestine was supporting terrorism, right? You always hear like terrorism, this is buzzword. But actually, the first time the word terrorism was used was in 1969 when it attempted to criminalize UNRWA. So even this word itself was an attempt to conflate kind of support for Palestine with terrorism. And just think to end here, I want to say that this is not only an employment. Like, I want to bring this in because I think it's really important that we get a bigger picture here. We have seen cases, for me, I see cases as young as 10 years old to even college students who are being harassed, doxxed for their support for Palestine. Organizations who support Palestine are being congressionally investigated. Like just yesterday, Mahmoud are being held at airports and investigated. And we saw the case of Mahmoud, who was again one of dozens of Mahmoud Khalid, one of dozens of students who not only had their visa revoked but were being detained. So right now, I guess we're seeing this resurgence of this post 9/11 environment of the criminalization of Arab and Muslims. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is that these cases of termination, punishment, doxing in the employment space and beyond, even these cases of deportations are all different tactics to isolate and intimidate Muslims and Arabs, right? To silence them. So it's no coincidence, again, that Mahmoud Khalid was picked up a week before the aggression resumed in Gaza. And the more aggressive these tactics get, it's only a reflection that, you know, people are starting to realize, hey, this is maybe not right, the way we're isolating people. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can, and Janetta, I just, first and foremost want to say thank you so much, one, for being on this panel and speaking about, kind of what your experiences, have been. And, I think this is, one of the things about myself and, I'm a, I was, voted class clown, in high school. And so I always, try to keep lighthearted, but, recently it's been, I've also found it challenging just being Palestinian. You almost feel like, you feel like just sharing that point about yourself, which is just it's like saying you're Italian, you feel almost like, do I lead? I'm part Italian and Greek. Do I lead with Italian and Greek? Because it feels like more, or if I say I'm Palestinian, are people going to think one way or the other about me? Like just, inherently. And so I think that, right now, as you mentioned, there's just a lot going on in our community. And so while, we try to continue to, move forward and celebrate, our amazing culture, not just the Arabic culture, but the Arab culture, we also have to, kind of really just sit with for a second all of the things that are going on and what's awesome about being an attorney. People talk about people don't become an attorney. I love being an attorney, because we can, who's better to have this sort of good, positive, constructive dialogue with one another from various realms and be able to discern, kind of what is happening and what we're experiencing and how we can go about it in the most productive and positive ways. And I think that really transitions well to Samaya here, who also thank you so much for being on the panel and talking with us today. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of jump into is as an attorney in a large law firm, you navigate regulatory spaces. How do you think about the balance between, or what do you think about the balance between that professional neutrality that maybe is important for our clients, just important for just any profession in the employment space, but also that personal advocacy aspect. If you are Palestinian or part of that MENA group, what is it like to kind of wear both hats in some ways? And have you seen, felt, or responded to any institutional pressures to perhaps stay silent or not speak about one issue or another?
Thanks, Yusuf. That's a great question. And I'm going to respond to it. I'm also going to try to react to what we just heard because, and what you also just said, right? So what you just said sounds like outing someone, right? For where they come from. You feel like you're being outed for being Palestinian American. And that's right. That's a common experience in large professional settings. Also, what we heard from, starting with Tariq through Janan, this is a very personal matter. for us lawyers who come from these areas of the world, right? Where either us personally or our families have gone through colonialism, war, occupation, whatever it is, right? These matters are incredibly personal. And oftentimes in the course of my career, I've had to ask myself whether my neutrality, right, which is, to your point, something that's valued as being a good lawyer, right? It shows credibility. You're weighing all the different options and creating and crafting your recommendation. But I often ask myself if I'm being silent, is it because I don't care? Is it because I'm afraid? What is it? Why am I silent? And so when I start to realize if it's because I'm afraid, I do something about it, something I'm comfortable doing that also is a little uncomfortable enough where I feel like I'm not complicit. I'm doing something about this that I can manage within my limited reach. And so one thing that I found very impactful in the course of my career is joining organizations where I can support my community, as well as, really being a very, as great of a healthcare lawyer as I can be, right? Becoming a better healthcare lawyer every single day so that I continue to have this position and be able to help other people come into this profession who are, unaware of this profession or unaware of the opportunities that are available in this profession. So that's my response. I hope that's helpful.
Super helpful. And just a little plug, because I want to make sure I do this too, in law, you have to think about the business development and too. So this is kind of a side note, but if anybody has, health or regulatory matters, Samaya is one of the best, in the industry. And I'm not just saying that because she paid me $100 before we got on the screen here, but really no, she's incredible. And all of the attorneys here, whether it's, transactional matters, litigation, civil rights issues, or just somebody, to talk to, you can just come to me and talk to me. I'm not even on the legal advice, just to, just like friends. But, I think that we have an incredible group, both of professionals and, just community members. And so, I appreciate you being on the, the Muslim Bar here in Chicago, and sharing your insight, on that end. Anybody else want to, chime in, on this question, specifically just about, the institutional pressures, if you felt any, maybe how you responded to that, or that, kind of, dual, complex, situation where you have that professional neutrality on one end that you're trying to balance, and then that personal advocacy, or that feeling of just like the personal ways in which everything around us has affected us in one way or another.
I think that I just have a few thoughts about the term professional neutrality in of itself. And often, especially as lawyers, this idea of neutrality is sort of described as this very core value in our field. Clients rely on us and they rely on us to be objective. And, you sort of a golden rule, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, just keep everything light. But I think that in today's context, for one, I don't think neutrality is, equals silence. I think that choosing silence or discouraging speech oftentimes is a tacit endorsement of a countervailing narrative. And so I think that it's difficult to really define what does being neutral mean, because I don't think being silent necessarily means you're being neutral. I think oftentimes silence can be a statement in of itself. That being said, I do think that when we're thinking about this idea of neutrality, especially in the way it's been, told to us as being such a valuable thing for clients, I think just in my career, I have found that clients respect authenticity. And I think that attorney-client relationship is built on trust and sort of seeing each other on a human level, not just as, legal professionals. So I think that I try to remind myself that it's important to show clients, prospective clients or current clients, that you're a person and you are shaped by your values and experiences and communities. And I don't think that sharing that is necessarily unprofessional. In fact, I think the opposite oftentimes. I think sharing that really fosters a lot more opportunities for collaboration and growth.
Thank you so much, Shara. And I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, we're all, humans just in general, we're all so unique and in so many different ways. And so advocacy doesn't have, one sort of form or another. There's no one size fits all. And the way, events or whatnot, affect us, just are different. And so I think it's kind of, nice to appreciate that in our community. I think one of the things being part of that Arab community is sometimes we're like, well, you're not speaking up, and I think that it's just different for everybody, and everybody has their own, sort of, I don't want to say lane, but just sort of, what makes, isn't comfortable and also, within their wheelhouse. I always go back to Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You can be so upset about the weather, raining on your wedding day or something, but you can't control the weather, but you can control your emotions or your, what you do next. And so I think it's important to always keep that in mind. And, I want to shift gears to, Ahmed, and I want to, kind of, ask a little bit about you've been, on the front lines of public facing advocacy for decades. And first and foremost, I just want to say thank you, just at a baseline for all that you do for our community. I think a lot of times folks in CARE and other important groups, the Muslim Legal Fund, maybe you don't always get that thanks that you really do deserve, and just wholeheartedly, we really appreciate all the efforts. And but I wanted to just ask, how have the boundaries around acceptable speech shifted in that post 9/11 era, and again in recent months with rising scrutiny around pro-Palestinian voices? What does that look like, and what are you seeing, Ahmed?
That's a great question, Yusuf. And one thing that I've tried to do in my 20-year career as an executive in the civil rights world is to have transparent, clear, and really bold conversations, open conversations, honest conversations. And we're about to have one right now, if you guys are ready for that. Not that we haven't been having it, but I want to sort of address an elephant in the room of sorts. And I think it's really important for legal practitioners to understand this context in this moment, because it is sort of a thread that runs through a lot of the really new and notable situations that we're dealing with as a community, and not just our community, but other communities as well. And that is namely the redefinition and changing of the goalposts re-anti-Semitism. And the reason why that's important is because it has a direct consequence. Now, let me first, just as a disclaimer, say that there is such a thing as anti-Semitism. There is such a thing as anti-Jewish bigotry. It is a problem. It is something that nobody who is of any moral fabric should support. And we as CARE Chicago, me specifically, have a long track record of standing against anti-Jewish bigotry with our Jewish colleagues and others when it rears its ugly face. And sometimes it does even in our own community. And when it does, we confront it. Having said that, what we're seeing today, and this goes back to the freedom of speech conversation, because you can't just come out and say, hey, you can't be pro-Palestinian. And you can't just say, as a Palestinian, you uniquely cannot speak. But what you can say is, anything you say, including that is just purely critical of a foreign government's activity, a genocide against your people, is hitherto, from now on, anti-Semitic. And so that's the cudgel that our community and others who are standing up against genocide, I don't even say pro-Palestinian because that almost sounds like someone is biased to the Palestinian nation or statehood or ethnicity, which is not the case amongst many people. It is more that they take issue with the wanton murder and maiming of children and women for the last year and a half, broadcast live on television with our tax money and with weapons that we're giving. And you're not allowed to say anything about it. And it's a matter of conscience, once again. So it's more pro-genocide, anti-genocide. That's what we're talking about. But just to be very clear, so I'm not talking in philosophy. The special Senate hearing and the special House hearing on anti-Semitism, that was on anti-Semitism, wink, wink, anti-genocide. People who are anti-genocide, they're accusing of anti-Semitism. SJP, they had I believe it was a resolution against them by the Senate, and because they were accused of being anti-Semitic. Teachers have been fired, students have been disciplined, employees have been fired or not hired, including present company. You just heard from Jinan Shahade. They've all been accused of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And again, they reference speech in which they stand up against genocide and criticize a foreign government, not actual anti-Semitism, actual anti-Jewish bigotry, which everybody here would stand up against. The weaponization of ICE, Mahmoud Khalil and these stories that we're hearing, USCIS, they come to them and they say, you're anti-Semitic and therefore you cannot be in this country because they stood up against genocide. Just today, or it was yesterday, Muslim Women's Coalition, a very well-known, 30-year-old organization in Milwaukee, they had their grant withdrawn from them by Archwell Foundation, which is Prince Harry's foundation, because guess what? They were accused of anti-Semitism because of an article that was written by its founder, in which she actually, in the very article, called Judaism a beautiful religion and hat-tipped the young Jewish students who say never again is never again for everybody, not just for Jews. That kind of language has been deemed anti-Semitic because in the same article, she dared to call Israel an apartheid state and to say that, Palestinians deserve freedom from the river to the sea, which again is a statement that's been misconstrued and misdefined by others. And it's a new definition has been put into it. So there's a lot of moving of the goalposts of these terminologies and words and phrases in order to render certain speech unacceptable. And that is the elephant in the room. That is the name of the game. That is the thread that goes through all of these things to censor and purge those who are anti-genocide today.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think one thing a couple things that I want to mention there. One, if you're not part of the Arab community, in terms of objectivity, an Egyptian being biased towards Palestine, Egyptians, are very usually pro-Egypt. The Dunya is the common expression, which means the mother, and so that objective piece is there. So thank you for touching on that. And look, I think that this is, one of those things where, we're bridging a lot of different parts of the law here, right? We have our, Ahmed, you're on, the forefront of what you're seeing in terms of the civil rights side. And we also have, a lot of our, business attorneys here. And, I think together we all kind of, make up just this, incredible piece of the law. And I'm so grateful to be a part of that, MENA community and contribute to the law in that way. But you mentioned that moving goalpost, because, some of my, best friends and really biggest allies, are of the Jewish faith. And so the worst thing that I think anybody can ever, be smeared with is the framing of being anti-Semitic. Nobody wants to be anti-Semitic. And in large part, we all try to actively make sure that we are, checking our language at the door every single time to ensure that we're being inclusive and making sure that we're not, putting out one group or the other, not just, on the anti-Semitic route, but just like, when it comes to our Black community and brothers and sisters out there, or Hispanic community out there, making sure that we're always trying to put our best foot forward. And so, so it is an uncomfortable conversation. And so, I just want to sit with that for a second. And this is hard. It's hard to have this conversation because it's, I think, just uncomfortable in nature. And I also think that, it's important though for us specifically, because who better to have this conversation than lawyers? Arguably, we're supposed to be those who are most articulate and able to kind of explain and understand, what this is breaking down to. And so, I kind of want to, kind of move on that and just, transition a little bit into, is there a legal difference between speech that is controversial and speech that is, professionally sanctionable? And how do lawyers, especially early career ones, navigate that gray area? Because on one end, you want to be like, hey, like, I lost family members and got, this is like happening, and on the other end, you're like, well, I don't want to just sharing that part about myself be something that like, gets me, fired or, shuns me from the community. And so, anybody want to jump in on that or jump in general?
Yeah, Yusuf, on the, advice to young lawyers on that aspect, I think it's important, and it wasn't something that I kind of was aware of or cognizant of when I was going through the, law firm selection interview process. But you really want to find an environment that just aligns with you, So there are law firms that are, have some sort of ideology. Other law firms have other ideologies, right? If you're able to assess that early on and find one that's in tune and aligned and has affinity groups or supports causes that you support, that's going to make your life a lot easier. I've seen friends go from one law firm where they felt unheard or disrespected or just overlooked and find a new environment that aligns with them. So my advice for young attorneys is when you're going through the process of looking where to look and who to be employed by, don't just focus on the salary, don't just focus on the substance, but also the environment and the culture.
Thank you, Todek. I think that's a big point. We actually got a question in, from our attendants, what can we say to younger lawyers, who want, speak up about this issue, but are afraid to, and how do you navigate that with employers? So I think you, kind of hit it on its nose there. So I appreciate that sort of insight. Anybody else? Sumaya, I saw you unmuted, so I want to turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you. I also read Janan Najib's statement in response to the funding cut or whatever. She's the founder of the Muslim Women Coalition. I thought her original article was also really insightful. And so I think this moment is not going to age well for our profession, right? When people want to stand up for against a genocide, against extermination of a people. What we see live streamed on our phones, right? And one of our biggest assets, right, is our fellowship with communities that help amplify our voices. And I feel like, I know that Ahmed touched a little bit on this, but it's through these, really important relationships where we can underscore what is actually at issue, the real issue, the genocide being the issue, right? Let's not make it a political thing. Just talk about what it is. Now, in terms of I do think that how we treat dissent is how we test our free speech, right? It's not a popular opinion, what Ahmed just said, right? But it's how we treat it, is that in fact hate speech? Would we call a opinion that, would we call anything that we say against Iran Islamophobic? Let me pose that question, right? So it's being critical of what's going on. And I think that's what we have to really be honest with ourselves about. And in terms of your response, in response to your question about, any advice about, and I think this advice is not just for students, I think it's for anybody who wants to, to say something. And it's to not be impulsive. It's to really be ready to say what you want to say and face the consequences of what could come back.
Yeah. So I couldn't agree more. I do think that this is a really important, part in time. And, I think that, in the long run, we'll look back and really see, who was on, who spoke up about, just the atrocities, the genocide that has, been unfolding in front of our eyes, and, who kind of worked to either put that under the rug or silence those who are raising awareness around it. And so I really appreciate that. And I also, just appreciate, you mentioning, just for our younger attorneys, I get asked this a lot, but it's, one of those things where it's, it's your life and your career. And, on one end, it's really important to love the work that you're doing, but it's also important to be authentic towards yourself. And so if you are, applying to a job and you really, want to be, vocal about what your family's experiencing in Palestine, I don't know if it's going to be a good sort of fit if you have to, silence that part of your, of that life, of really that makeup of who make, what your overall culture is. And so it's important just to consider that, because, you can only, be inauthentic and, for so long before you really want to, be your true self and, share what's going on and raise awareness around, because it's maybe the unpopular opinion, but one of the oaths we all take as Illinois attorneys is that we will always, whether good for us economically or just favorably socially, we will always stick up for those who are oppressed and those who are voiceless. That is our oath to the Constitution here in the Illinois State Court, and also the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's important that we really uphold that sort of integrity and that fabric of what makes lawyers lawyers. I mean, this is an important profession, and so I really appreciate all that you all are doing on this end. And so, kind of moving it over, I think we're at that halfway point. We've addressed some questions that we've had in the forum here, and I wanted to flip this over to Janan here. Each of Janan, Yara, Todek, maybe if all of you guys want to kind of touch on this. Each of you have navigated elite institutions, if you will, while also holding strong community or identity-based values. How have you balanced being unapologetically Arab or Muslim in spaces that often don't make room for that, or as if you feel that they don't make room for that? And have you ever faced consequences or felt the need to self-censor in any way? And so maybe I'll start with Yara and Todek. Have you ever felt that sort of pressure, whether in in your current role or just any roles in general in your professional career?
Yara, you're always welcome to jump in ahead of me.
I figured I would let you go first.
Okay.
I saw you
No,
go for the unmute button.
Well,
no, I can take this one. Yeah, just I've been, I think, just lucky in a way in the way my career's progressed here. I mean, it's only been one place of employment, but Baker has been very inclusive and open to DEI initiatives. We had a great seminar where people flew in from all over North America 2 weeks ago to say, we are not neutral, right? Essentially. So, and I think that stems from, Baker just being an international based law firm. So you have law firms all across the world. So there are people that work here are naturally open towards other cultures, ideologies, and makeup. So, for me, I haven't ran into those issues, but something that I have learned over time is that instead of, shying away from my background or my identity, it's actually a superpower or a strength. If you are open about who you are, Egyptian American, Muslim, and you make that known to your colleagues, hopefully, they're respectful and, reasonable people. But a lot more of the time, they're going to actually respect you more and actually be more accommodating. So I see it as a strength, rather than something to shy away from and hide.
And I think it helps that you're really good at soccer too, and you guys got to have Mohamed Salah, and so that really maybe you can
That
lean
is
into
true.
that a little bit. And so, colleagues, got to dabble with a little fun, in here as well. I told you it was going to be an entertaining and important panel, and and I think what you said is really important and powerful. Like it's, some firms are really navigating this well. I'm at Shook, and I thought Shook already has been an incredible firm on this end. We started a Middle Eastern employee resource group, just so folks across the board can have a space in which they feel comfortable just kind of share more about who they are and what they're experiencing. And we have folks from all ends. Several folks who are of an Israeli background who come in, and we have these real dialogues. And I think it's really helpful because at the end of the day, the more that we learn about each other, the more that we have dialogue with one another, and the more that we really just kind of get to the root of it, the more that we can hopefully navigate these sort of tough times. And so, Yara, I know you were also eager to jump in on that. Have you had any experience that that were different in any way, or anything to add? Otherwise, I can come back to you later on in the forum as well.
Yeah, I mean, as far as addressing the latter part of your question first, I haven't experienced any specific consequences from my employer, related to my identity. That being said, I have certainly felt pressure to assimilate, I think just naturally throughout my life and through my professional career. And I think that's something that's sort of a constant tug of war, probably for a lot of people that come from, underrepresented backgrounds. There's always this idea of what the most professional, most successful person looks like. And oftentimes it doesn't look like me. And I think that's something that is really at the forefront anytime you are in an environment that just naturally doesn't have people that look like you and have your same background and same experiences. But I totally agree with Tariq in the sense that, over time, and I have come to realize and continue to believe that hiding parts of yourself or trying to downplay parts of myself doesn't make me better at my job. It actually does the opposite, makes me less authentic, and doesn't allow me to bring a full perspective to whatever work environment I'm in. And that doesn't necessarily even have to be at a law firm, but just whether it's talking to prospective clients or actually representing somebody in court that comes from a totally different background than you, and being able to talk to them on a human level and have certain experiences with that person that some of your colleagues might not have. There's a lot that a lot of good things about being different that isn't necessarily highlighted a lot, but I do think peeks its way in ways that you don't expect. So for young lawyers out there that I think are probably maybe sometimes going through that mental battle in their head about assimilating or downplaying certain parts of themselves, I would just encourage you to really step into who you are and don't be afraid of doing that.
Thank you so much, Har. And being Arab is beautiful. Being Arab, not Arabic. We got great music. You guys love our food, hummus, tabbouleh, shawarma. And I already said we got Mohamed Salah, and let's see if Liverpool keeps him. So, there's just so much, to be to celebrate really in this month and just in general. And that's one thing that I just love. And I'm really grateful to be celebrating this with all of you. I know it's tough times, really tough time and incredibly important to continue to discuss, what everything going on. And I'm, want to turn it over to Jeanette, to continue, something that you brought up earlier. But I just wanted to touch on the beauty of our culture because it truly is, incredible. And I'm so grateful to be a part of that. And, Jeanette, earlier you touched on a little bit about, some personal and professional repercussions really coming out of Georgetown Law. Incredible law school, by the way, and you were doing incredible work there. But to have your offer from the firm revoked, just simply for whether attending a protest or just being Palestinian, you didn't even start yet. So I imagine you didn't come in with a picket sign, or anything, as I joked about earlier. But what does it mean to speak up anyway? And what would you tell other students or young attorneys who are afraid to do the same? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really big question because obviously there's a lot of fear, especially today with the youth around speaking up in general. And I think for me, it helps in like contextualizing what happened after I was fired as well. For me, I grew up in Bridgeview, a very highly politicized environment, just because everything is in Arabic everywhere you go. It's called literally Little Palestine on Google Maps. So I grew up in an environment where people being raided by the FBI, like literally disappearing, surveillance was kind of a daily basis for me. So again, being rooted in my identity was just so important. And then when everything happened after I was fired, I've kind of sat with it just to reel and figure out what my next step was. Everything that I had worked for my entire career just turned to nothing. But I remember in that same week, Breem, the soul of souls, she was killed. I was also worried for my own family back home. Wadi al-Fayoumi, who is an Illinois 6-year-old boy, was stabbed 26 times for being Muslim and Arab. So when all these things were around me, I realized it really wasn't about me. It was about how I could use this opportunity to advocate for my community. Because again, the stakes were too high at that point. So I not only spoke up against this termination, but also pursued legal action that this type of discrimination, it's not something that will be our new norm, right? That we also demand accountability, that someone who looks like me, that is in the legal field in any space, is not disposable just because they come in with their like authentic self. And for young attorneys, again, I think it's a very difficult time, but I also would kind of caution them to not fall into despair. I've spoken at dozens of different law schools and conferences over the past year and a half, and I could honestly say that this new generation coming into the legal field is something that we've never seen before. It's almost not even a question if they're going to speak up against this injustice, but it's a matter of how can we do it most effectively. So to that, I would say to young attorneys, first, do not let the fear control you, let the risks inform you. So do not let the fear control you, let the risks inform you. But also lean to community. There are so many people that are willing to support, to guide you through this process. Again, there's people power. When I was fired, there was an entire coalition of people that came together to make sure that not only me, but the hundreds of other people in the legal field that were being fired had jobs, had mentorship, had a backbone to go back to. So again, it's a very difficult time, but know that the tide is really shifting. And this is really the time where we have an opportunity to reshape the legal field where it's reflective of the people and where really people can bring in their authentic self in different ways.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. One, the legal field is better now that you're in it. Thank you so much for being a part of this and also being open about your experiences. I think sometimes it can be hard, to try to navigate that. And I think the default maybe to feel uncomfortable and not want to share that. And I think it's really empowering to share that experience. And Ahmed, I want to turn it over to you because we have a question from the audience, and it kind of stems with one that we had kind of curated as part of this program, but it's in a time where the government is actively attacking private organizations and persons, or what are some things that individuals can do to support affected minority groups, like the Palestinian community or those part of the MENA group, in light of both the administration's actions and sometimes their own organization's hesitance to advocate for those same groups? Is there anything that you'd recommend on that front?
So we have to understand the name of the game, what is happening right now. We have to understand what is happening. And I don't think that it's even the intention of the government or the third-party organizations that are working with the government, and there are such organizations. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil's name was not, drummed up from some database with the government. It was fed to them by Bitar, a third-party organization that has a whole hit list that it's been all over social media, beating its chest about. And you see this also with a lot of the ICE raids that are happening. In any case, they're not, in my opinion, even in their own intention, trying to arrest and deport everybody who's critical of genocide or everybody who is in a Latin gang or whatever it is. Rather, it is having enough of those to instill enough fear in the rest of us that it has the same desired effect. So rather than them having to censor everyone and remove everyone, there is almost a process of self-censorship and self-removal because of the fear that is triggered by everyone seeing what is happening around them. And to a large degree, this could work. It is working to a certain extent. I've had so many calls from people who are saying, look, I'm traveling, I'm deleting my social media, I've said this about Palestine. Should I say anything about Palestine? Should I delete everything I've said about Palestine against genocide? And so people are thinking rationally through this for self-preservation. And I think that is the name of the game. So the answer to that is, if that is what they're trying to suppress the American people with, is for us not to fall for it. Is for us to maintain what I consider to be the 3 C's, moral courage, moral clarity, and moral consistency. And the courage has to come first, because once we call their bluff, they're not going to be able to come after everybody. And you do this in a clear way. By clarity, I mean, look, we're responsible for our own speech. And this is a message to all the young attorneys here. I think it's very important. Just because you have the courage to talk about something doesn't mean that you will talk about it effectively and in a way that does it justice, unless you train yourself to do so and not fall into rhetorical pitfalls that both hurt you and the cause that you're representing. So it's on us, the speakers, to represent those who represent these perspectives and these communities and these causes in the legal profession and beyond, to responsibly articulate the rationale and the logic so that other people can understand them. And lastly, you have to be consistent. If you do it for Muslims, you do it for Jews. If you do it for Hindus, you do it for Buddhists. If you do it for whites, you do it for blacks. It's not, you can't just be just for your own community and not be consistently just. So I think that's the way that you respond to that.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I was actually thinking about getting a burner phone because I watched the show Mo on Netflix, great show. And I was like, is this show, going to get me, in trouble? Joking, but Palestinian olive oil, by the way, incredible as well. Just a little plug for that. No, Ahmed, I think that the courage, clarity, consistency, I really resonate, with what you said there. And I like that you said courage has to come first, because I really do think that without that courage component, the rest just kind of, dissipates or maybe isn't, addressed. And so, I appreciate you saying that. And, I do think that fear, is spreading, especially those, outside of, our community, inside our community. And so I want to turn now to, kind of all the panelists here. When institutions we work for or aspire to lead, are silent in moments of mass injustice, maybe they're concerned about, large law firms being, pointed at or affected in large part, what is our ethical obligation as lawyers, whether a part of that firm or not, and is being silent the same as being, complacent? And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but, what about when it matters, when matters are being ignored or silenced, rise to a level of genocide or ethnic cleansing, as really what we're seeing, over I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, since it started, and any sort of thoughts about what we can do as lawyers in terms of just how we can try to affect the situation positively and effectively? It's a tough question.
I can start us with this one, I guess. It's a big question, so I'll try to be brief to give others a chance. But I think with this, I actually want to highlight first, like, why it's especially important as we as lawyers are asking ourselves these questions and trying to, I guess, speak up. But as we know, the law is not only shaped by society, but it shapes society. It is the ultimate codifying force. Once something's in law, as we know, creates precedent and is very difficult to undo. So now we're at a point where our role as lawyers is to redistribute the power of the law to the people, to get the legal field at a point where it's reflective of the people. And to a point where, I guess, where, again, when I was talking about the beginning of a litmus test, where there is no litmus test, where there is no isolation of Arabs, Muslims, or different minority groups, when it is not free speech except for Palestine. So this is why our role, I think, is very crucial for us today, because again, what happens in the next couple of years, specifically in the legal field, will not only shape future generations to come and the legal framework that they work in, but in general, because all our struggles are interconnected, like Yusuf, you pointed out so beautifully. And at the very basic level, I think we as lawyers, obviously, we took up an oath to uphold justice in all its forms. So we refuse to make, the burning of babies, the people being fired, terminated, deported for their free speech, our new norm. There's actually a quote by Thurgood Marshall that always comes to my mind when we talk about these conversations. He said, the Constitution was not written for us, but we know that no matter what it takes, we're going to make it work for us. You do what is right and you let the law catch up. Yeah. So something for me, as a youth, as an Arab, as a Muslim that's watching my family back home struggle, that's been terminated, fired, harassed, and that's watching my colleagues be deported, literally. I realize that we are at a point where we have to make the law reflective of the people. So whether it's talking to your partners about what it means to be an Arab and a Palestinian, or volunteering your hours, we all have a duty to rise to the occasion really at this time and be brave and be courageous and do what is right.
Thank you, Janine. Late last year, there was an article. I don't know how to speak Arabic, but I can read it. Bad Arabic school, put it that way. And I saw it was 20 of my family members, Shukani, had just been killed in their home, in Gaza, and it was something that just really, I never got to meet them. For folks who don't know, if your family's in the West Bank, they can't go to Gaza, and in Gaza, the West Bank, and so I never even had the chance to meet most of them. And I think it's just really important to understand that, like, there's just a lot that is unpacking here, and so it's important to speak up for family and for those who are voiceless, whether in here or abroad. And one of the questions we have in our audience here is what is the most important thing most American lawyers do not understand but would benefit from knowing about Arab American lawyers, MENA lawyers, and the MENA legal community in general? Bouncing around a little here. Sorry, my ADHD. Yeah.
No, you're fine, Yusuf. I want to start by saying I'm so sorry for your loss. And in response to the question, maybe it's just what I started with, which is we're not a homogenous group, just like any other group. And the same way you're getting to know a bunch of diverse people, people that are different to you, we're meeting you and you're different to us. It's mutual. We're all starting to get to know each other a little bit better as the world gets smaller. And so we are, we're not homogenous in a variety of ways: race, religion, the languages we speak, the different dialects we speak, right? I don't understand every Arabic dialect. How many generations out we are from our immigrant relatives. The list goes on.
Thank you, Sumaya. I always was thinking about learning Egyptian Arabic because I understand, that's the Hollywood of the Middle East, and so a lot of people understand, but look at Ahmed and Tariq and Yaris, they get excited, they hear that, my mother-in-law when I say that.
Dialect, it's not the one I speak, but it's my favorite because of that reason. It's what you see in the movies.
Yeah, but the Levantine is beautiful, but that's the Palestinians. I'm gonna put a plug in there for Ahmed. I saw you unmuted. I wanted
I,
you
just, I
to.
wanted to add to that, and very well
Yeah.
said, Sumaya, but I think Arab American and MENA American lawyers, like the general Arab community and MENA community, have grown up in this country not on a blank slate where they get to chisel whatever they want and define themselves for themselves, but rather in an environment in which there have been so much in Hollywood and so much in American pop culture and Western pop culture that has misdefined our culture and our people, that they've had to start almost from underground, work their way up to ground zero, and then start to build their own reality, or convey their own reality of who they are and what their culture represents. For example, the average person, including a lot of lawyers, may look at the Arab world as a sort of strife-riven, area with strife and conflict, and that part of the Middle East where there's only one democracy, everybody else is just running around, chopping their heads off and bleeding to the ground and all that. But if you were to go to the Middle East, anywhere in the Middle East, you will find that the common thread, and now we're talking about the actual cultural values, and Yusuf, when you spoke about cultural beauty, it is so important to talk about the values. I was at Arab American Heritage Month, the resolution of City Council yesterday, and I swear to God, if one more council member thanked us for our T-bones and our lamb chops, I would have lost it. I mean, thank you, but there's more to it than the food and the clothing and the music and the soccer. There are the values. And the values are very strong and very clear. Family values, the values of what we say in Egyptian gadana, or sort of, standing up for someone who needs you to stand up for them, picking up the little guy, standing up for the little guy, hospitality. If you're in our home, even if you're our enemy, we can't hurt you, we can't disrespect you. All of these beautiful, chivalrous, very Arab cultural values are part of these attorneys' world and their identity and how they do their work. And so I think that's something that's very good to know and to sort of explore further, because you'll find a world of beauty therein.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to add to that really quickly, I think Ahmed, you put it so beautifully in Sumaya, because I think in a world hell bent on dehumanizing Arabs, it's just so important to humanize them. And especially someone that grew up in a post 9/11 era. Actually, just yesterday, somebody was telling me, listen, for the next 4 years, we have to do what we did like after 9/11, like be invisible, be quiet, just like retreat back into your communities. We just have to survive, right? But I think for a lot of Arab Americans, including myself, we're tired of being invisible. We don't want to wash down our identity and our values anymore just to be acceptable, right? That we want to be we want to be American, truly. So that's something I think I was thinking about, like we are in the post 9/11 era of our generation, but this time our people are ready to face it head on. We know we're more united, we're more stronger, not only between, I'm not even talking about between Arabs, but right now in the legal community. The fact that we're having this conversation means times have changed and we're not invisible anymore.
Thank you both so much. You brought up that American piece. It brought me to this 3-day country festival. That I was at. I love country music. I also love Arabic music, but country music. Luke Bryan is my go-to.
See how diverse Arabs are? We have one of those.
Right. Mo is I think Mo really highlights it, especially with the Hispanic community as well. I mean, there's just so much overlap between, all Americans. It really is just this truly great, melting pot. Ahmed, Sumaya, Yada, one thing I did want to touch on here, and I don't want to, say you're a young lawyer and now you're at a firm, or wherever it is, at an employer. You've each played a role in your, in institutional change, whether building ERGs, shaping law firm culture, maybe it's externally in, legal groups, or leading national civil rights organizations. What are some practical tools for creating space within institutions, without burning bridges or being labeled a troublemaker? How can you do that like effectively and in a really professional like manner? Any recommendations there?
I think that, one of the difficult things about pushing for change within your institution is doing it in a way that's effective, but doesn't leave you, isolated or labeled and also burnt out, because it can be really difficult to, take those kind of responsibilities on. I think that, my advice as far as practical tools would be, initially try to build quiet coalitions before going to do the public statement or whatever change you are trying to implement within your organization. Start with one-on-one conversations, reach out to colleagues privately. It's always more effective to have multiple voices behind you if you are going to try to effectuate some sort of institutional change. And it's going to be more likely that there is going to be change when there are multiple voices in the room instead of just one. I also think that it's important, and this sort of relates to Ahmed's point about how to advocate in a way that is effective and does the cause justice. I think it's important to identify your goals before speaking up. Are you trying to educate? Are you trying to change a policy? Are you trying to create a cultural shift? Because depending on what those goals are, your tone and your approach are going to differ. For example, at the firm, I did a presentation on the month of Ramadan, just what it means, and how it might affect energy levels or sort of the times in which I'm online. And my goal in that presentation wasn't to make some sort of grand statement. It was really just to inform people, to educate them about what this month means for me and for other Muslim attorneys, and why it's such an important month for us spiritually, and why work and other obligations necessarily have to take a back seat. So I thought it was, but if my goal were something else, right? If I wanted to implement some sort of Ramadan policy where everybody works from home during the entire month, right? My approach would have been different. My tone would have been different. So I think it's important anytime you're trying to take on any sort of advocacy to really be thoughtful about what your goal is at the outset. And then determine, okay, how am I going to state this in a way that's going to effectuate the most positive change and impact?
We should talk more on that Ramadan policy. It kind of sounds kind of nice. I think we could all.
I mean, I did it off the books, I'll tell you that.
Samaya,
We all do, right? That's yeah, no, and that's being a person, right? And I've always been in private practice. I've always been in big law my whole career. I've had the pleasure of working at two different firms, where I approach this kind of the same way. And perhaps you can tell by my temperament or whatever, but I'm not very confrontational. I'm more constructive. And so if it's like an outdated policy, right? Like coming at it with some questions, I want to understand more about what is this outdated because this was you didn't have in mind the people who come from different backgrounds, and this is like a 30-year-old policy, and you didn't have so many different didn't have so much diversity in your firm before, and certainly like finding friends, right? Finding allies who are interested in the same issue. I agree with what you said, everything you said, Yada, but also that point you said at the beginning, like you can't care about every issue, right? You don't have enough time in the day. So if it's something that's really, really super important to you and you're willing to take on, that role of being a liaison even, right? Go for it. But oftentimes, I just don't like to put people on the defensive. I really like to have it be more constructive. Also, I think that goes back to what other people have said. I think a lot of times it's just an opportunity for education. Oh, at my current firm at McDermott, I love that, I tag team our different communications around Ramadan and Eid and all that, right? And providing information about how, that this might impact our work schedules. People might not be answering your call, after sunset. They'll be coming back online later, whatever it is. So yeah.
Thank you, Samaya. And again, going to her style, if you are in the health and regulatory, industry, non-confrontational attorney, somebody who's going to be very constructive, Yada with her quick legal advocacy. Ahmed is going to be giving me speeching lessons after this, with confidence. And so if you need a civil rights, Attorney Janan, Tadic, so incredible attorneys. I'm really grateful to be on this panel. Now, we have about 5 minutes here. And so I do just want to open it up to all of you. We've hit on most of the questions that we've had, coming out of the forum in one way or the other. And so is there anything that, we didn't touch on that, you really wanted to hit on? Open floor?
Maybe
Yeah.
I can give a take on, I'm sorry, go ahead. You haven't
Go
spoken.
ahead, Ahmed.
Oh,
Go ahead,
please,
Ahmed.
please. The more handsome Egyptian goes first.
Not true, not true. No, I think like one point that Sumaya touched on earlier on, and Yara kind of touched on as well, is finding a way if you're trying to advocate for change or like do something at a bigger scale, it's finding those friends and allies within internally as well. So you can go about it through the advocacy and rallies and social media posts, which is a necessary and vital and important way of advocating. And at the same time, internally try to build those allies and coalitions to kind of, I think when I started, um, where I'm working at, there's only a handful of MENA Arabic attorneys, and now there's a group of maybe 10 of us, right? And so when you're able to build up and lift up those attorneys that come from similar backgrounds or similar ideologies, it just makes you stronger. And so I think that's something to really keep in mind as we continue to progress throughout our professional careers.
We should do a podcast, you and Jeanette, because I think you guys have different forms of advocacy, maybe. And one thing that I think is important that a lot of people don't realize is that, in any sort of, anything that, has ever happened, there's so many different channels in which people, utilize advocacy. And so there's no one size fits all, and everybody has an equally important part. And so, but I love that, but I just think that you guys would debate a little bit, and I think it'd be kind of entertaining. So I'm just putting that out there that maybe we could do like a post.
No, I totally agree with everything Alex. I think everybody has a role. Maybe my role is a little bit louder. Yeah, I totally agree.
Now all of a sudden, Tarek's microphone comes up back on. Okay, let's go back to the other very equally handsome Egyptian, up top here, Ahmed.
Well, I just want to take sort of a take on the last question that you had asked about advice for our young attorneys in terms of advocacy. And I think that lawyers are best suited for all forms of advocacy, including social justice advocacy and civil rights advocacy, and the sort of issues that we're seeing in the moment that are threatening America, let alone innocent people around the world. Lawyers are best suited for that because lawyers are trained to not vent in place of fact finding and not to fall into rhetoric in place of, analyzed and researched work. And so I think research and analysis, I mean, these are not things that are left for the NASA scientist or the engineer. I would tell our young lawyers to base and root your advocacy in good research and good analysis. So many people, for example, talk about Palestine, but they have very little numbers, not just data about who's dying and all of that, but things that have happened in the past that are very compelling and convincing in terms of resolutions, in terms of agreements, in terms of just comparing what has happened here and there. Just using one example here. I mean, there are many different causes in the world, but you can't be coming out and venting about issues and being rhetorical while missing the whole bigger picture of the facts and numbers and stories, human stories. Because let's face it, even with my understanding of the Holocaust and most people's, 6 million, it affects one part of your brain, but that number could have been 12 million, it could have been 4 million, it could have been 2 million, probably would have the same reaction versus one Anne Frank story where you have a face, you have the emotions, and you have the reality of what she went through that really brings it home, brings the horrors of the Holocaust home. Similarly, as you're advocating for Gaza, for example, you can't just be throwing the numbers. I mean, you should do the research and analysis, but also you should bring the human stories so that people can relate. And it goes back to what Jeanette said, the humanizing, because the game is dehumanization. And so the response is to bring that humanity back and force it into the equation.
I think that's a great point, Ahmed, and really drives home. I think now the toll is at 61,709, but Palestinians who have been killed in Gaza, since October 2023, and I just think it's like what that number looks like, and is just insane. And of those, 17,492 are children, and with dreams and incredible skills in soccer and so much more. So, I think that really, resonates in a lot of ways. Ahmed, thank you so much for, raising that. Anything else for the open floor? Otherwise, I am going to just do some, closing remarks here. Got this all set up.
I just wanted to,
yeah.
Sorry, if we have to end, that's completely fine. But I just wanted to point out, because I know today's Palestinian Political Prisoners Day, I just want to honor the prisoners that we also have here. I think we always think about political prisoners as a third world overseas thing, but to honor Mahmoud Khalil, Rumaisa, and the other students that are currently being held in ICE detention facilities, the Latin American El Salvador immigrants are currently being held with them as well. and also members of the Holy Land Fine from Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan Elishi, who again have been imprisoned for over a decade for simply giving humanitarian aid to Palestinians. So I think in this moment, it's really important for us to recommit ourselves to this fight for justice in all its forms, and to really ask ourselves that in a time where, decades are really happening in years and years are happening in days, things are moving so much quicker. What will be our legacy at this time? Will it be that we, and this is a big question, like, will it be that we kind of cowered into fear, or that we stepped up to the plate, right? And that we gave it all that we could in the legal field.
Thank you so much, Gina. And that's a great point. April 17th in the MENA community, specifically the Palestinian community, it is Palestinian Prisoners Day. And what it is it really raises awareness about all of the Palestinian prisoners who are taken. There's, a lot of people don't know that, children, the only place in the world in which children are tried in military court, as young as 12-year-olds is in Israel. And most of them don't have legal representation. Most of them, their parents don't even know, where they're at. And most of the charges, if any charges, are for throwing a stone, or in a lot of cases, there are no charges at all, and they are allowed to still be detained for years on end. And it is incredibly sad, and also an important injustice that, again, as lawyers, we should continue to raise awareness about. And so I'm glad you brought that up and raised it, especially on April 17th here as in Arab American Heritage Month. Okay, well, with that, and I hate goodbyes. It's not goodbyes until the next podcast, until the next forum. I just want to, just say, thank you all for being with us today, both on the panel and who are viewing in. What we witnessed over the past hour was not just, a panel. It was really a reflection on the strength, complexity, and resilience of the MENA voices, the beauty in our Arab American culture, in the legal profession. Each of our panelists brought with them not only deep legal insight, as we heard from Tariq on the transactional realm, Ahmed in the civil rights end, and so many more, but also lived experience too, and often that goes unheard and unrepresented in our field. We talked about advocacy, but we also modeled it. We spoke about free speech, not as an abstract principle, but as something deeply personal, often risky, sometimes costly, and sometimes just used to scare us, as Ahmed mentioned earlier. And it's important that we all stay true, to who we are as MENA individuals and as MENA attorneys. And we are reminded, and we reminded ourselves that our work as Arab, Middle Eastern, North African lawyers does not exist in a vacuum. It lives in the tension between professionalism and identity, between the courtroom and the community, between silence and courage to speak. To our panelists, thank you for your candor, your brilliance, and your grace. You honored the space with both intellect and vulnerability. To everyone here, I hope you walk away not only more informed about our beautiful community, but are more grounded in the importance of making space for Arab American attorneys, for North African attorneys, for folks of the Muslim community, and so much more here in the legal world. Heritage Month is not a box just to check, it's a call to action, to uplift, to connect, to reflect, and to build as a community and as allies. Let's carry forward today's conversation into our firms, our law schools, our courtrooms, and our communities. Let's advocate not just on behalf of our clients, but also on behalf of each other. I wrote this speech last night. I hope it still hits the same. It sounded really good when I was writing it. Thank you all so much again. And with that, I will turn it over to Sandra, who we are incredibly grateful as well. IILP has been, we're really grateful for this space and this opportunity. Thank you so much, Sandra.
Thank you, Yusuf. Well said. I want to thank all of our panelists, Tariq Akil, Janan Shahad, Samaya Noosh, Yara Rashad, Ahmed Rahab, our brilliant moderator, Yusuf Shukani, of course, our staff, Jennifer Jackson and Linda Chanow, and of course you, our audience. If you enjoyed this discussion and you found it worthwhile, we invite you to join ILP's other efforts. On April 30th, in anticipation of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be live streaming a different sort of History and Heritage Month webinar from our Asian lawyers in Europe and North America conference in London. Hierarchy, Pedigree, and Caste: The Myths and Realities of Upward Mobility for Asian Lawyers and Legal Professionals. We'll discuss and compare British, Asian, and Asian American experiences and perspectives around the particular challenges for lawyers and legal professionals professionals of Asian ancestry. More information is on our website, or please reach out to us to find out how you can join us. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Have a good evening.